Oh, hi friends. Didn't see you there. I don't know if you've been paying attention to current events or not, but there's a kerfuffle in Europe between Russia and Ukraine. And even though the invasion didn't start until February of 2022, the conflict really goes back at least as far as February of 2014, when the Russian puppet and then president Viktor Yanukovych fled to Russia, leaving much of Ukraine in chaos. But you really can't understand Ukraine 2014 if you don't at least understand a little bit about the Cossacks. Modern Cossacks trace their heritage to self-ruled communities of horse people who lived hundreds of years ago in southern Russia and eastern Ukraine. Like people who ride horses, not centaurs. Cossacks worked for the Russian czars to suppress rebellions and fight in wars, and as a result, the military is deeply woven into Cossack traditions. When the Soviets took over, they suppressed the Cossack culture, preferring everyone adopt a new Soviet nationality, and as a result, thousands of Cossacks were killed and thousands more fled Russia. But the Cossack warrior culture and traditions lived on, mostly in the Red Army. You know that funny Russian dance thing? It's called the hopak, and that's just one example of Cossack culture. In fact, most of the things you think of that are Russian are actually Cossack. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the Cossacks in most countries went back to their traditional community roots. But Russian leaders worked to co-opt the Cossack culture, rebranding them with a distinctly political flair that demanded loyalty to the Cossack people and to the state. This dovetailed nicely with Putin's promotion of conservative values with a strong emphasis on loyalty to the state. As a result, Cossacks in Russia began seeing themselves as avatars for all things Russian, similar to cowboys in the United States or samurai in Japan. Today, Cossack organizations in Russia boast over 5 million men who count themselves as loyal officers of the Russian culture. Most of them have military experience, and all of them believe that it is their duty to oppose any threat to Russia, especially anyone espousing Western values. When the gays are protesting for equal rights or a band plays a song critical of Putin, it's the Cossacks that are dishing out the beatings on behalf of the Russian government. Russian Cossack groups also control several military academies in Russia. If you've seen videos of children marching in formation or assembling Kalashnikovs, they are from one of these state-run Cossack schools that teach just 2 commandments. Love Russia, for she is your mother and no one will ever replace her. And those who march against your motherland are your enemies. Cossacks are technically civilians, so they're well suited to suppress the populations hostile to Russia, which is what they did in both Chechen wars, Serbia in the 90s, the 2000 invasion of Georgia, and in Nagorno-Karabakh in 2020. But their role as paramilitary troops has been far more pronounced in Ukraine. No one knows exactly when the first calls went out, but by January of 2014, thousands of Cossacks had come to Ukraine to counter-protest the Maidan and defend the Yanukovych pro-Russian government. In most of the country, they were completely outnumbered by the pro-Maidan crowd and were run out of most cities as soon as Yanukovych fled Russia. But in Crimea, they were a part of a bigger plan. If you don't already know, Crimea is a peninsula in the south of Ukraine and on the northern coast of the Black Sea. With a temperate and subtropical climate, it's been a really popular tourist destination for as long as tourism has been a thing. There's about 2.4 million people that live on this vacation hotspot, but Crimea is also home to several military bases, including there's a giant Russian naval port at Sevastopol, which is home to the Russian Black Sea Fleet. It's one of the most important pieces of land for both Ukraine and Russia. Yet, in February and March of 2014, Russia just walked in and took the peninsula, and the whole world barely blinked. How did they do it? Well, I don't pretend to know everything. I'm sure there's plenty of classified things Russia will never admit to, but this seems to be the series of events that led up to Russia occupying Crimea. The Cossacks, along with a Russian biker gang loyal to Putin called the Night Wolves, and a group of former FSB agents arrived in Crimea to set the stage for a possible Russian takeover of the peninsula in January. Through that month and most of February, they held peaceful rallies surrounding government buildings and asking for things like a declaration of solidarity with the government in Kyiv. This had the effect of conditioning police to see the pro-Russian crowd as benign. On February 20th, everything changed. More than 100 Maidan protesters were gunned down in Kyiv by the Yanukovych government. The massacre sent shockwaves through the country. Thousands of police quit. At a little before midnight, on the 21st, President Yanukovych fled to Russia, and even more police quit. In Crimea, the protests up until that point had been peaceful, but no more. The police couldn't physically stop the two sides from fighting once they got close. And both sides felt they had an existential threat they had to defend against.
Скажите, а вот чем вам не нравится Европа?
Мы в Европу.
А что там может и нравиться? Нет, мы... Гендерный фашизм, гомосексуальные браки, это может и нравиться. Вы хотите вот...
Мы не из-за того, что мы там за Россию или там мы хотим за отделение. Вопрос в том, чтобы люди жили при любом правительстве, пусть это будет правительство, оно будет нормальное.
Чтобы они могли высказать свое мнение, его услышали.
Его же не слышат.
Ну, нас до Киева никто не услышит.
Нас просто не слышат.
Like so many who died here, Volodymyr's father, Sergei, didn't look like a revolutionary. He was a schoolteacher. Sergei was alive when his fellow protesters rushed him to a makeshift clinic in a hotel reception area. He'd been shot in the back and died later.
I know who guilty in this situation, and part of regime Yanukovych, and first of all it's the Russian Federation and of course Putin.
According to Putin, it was that night that he gave the secret order for Russia's annexation of Crimea to his Security Council. On the morning of the 22nd, the bikers began dispersing pro-Ukraine protests and signing locals up for civil defense squads, while the Cossacks started setting up roadblocks and cutting off Crimea from the mainland, detaining pro-Western journalists and people that they knew were pro-Maidan protesters. On the same day, a group of former FSB agents brought out the big guns. About 60 men armed with machine guns and grenade launchers started occupying local government buildings, forcing pro-Ukrainian officials out and appointing pro-Russian officials in their place. The police were either unable or unwilling to stop them. After 5 days, all of the important positions in civil government were pro-Russian and under the leadership of Sergei Askanov, the newly appointed Prime Minister of Ukraine. In 2010, when he ran for Prime Minister, Askanov received just 4% of the vote, so he wasn't exactly a popular dude. But he was the head of a party called the Unite with Russia Party, so I think we all know how he got that job. In the weeks to come, hundreds of Russian state journalists flooded Crimea in an attempt to control the narrative around the eventual annexation. On February 26th, an interim government in Kyiv was established, but the new government lacked legitimacy. Several of the oblasts would not follow laws passed by the new interim government, and the new election had to be planned for the 25th of May. Putin denounced the new government as a coup d'etat and declares that Russia reserves the right to use all available options, including force at the last resort. That same day, more than 20,000 heavily armed and unmarked soldiers dubbed Little Green Men flooded Crimea, taking over the Cossack checkpoints, entering some of the Ukrainian military bases, and blockading the other ones. Cossacks and locals who were sympathetic to Russia quickly took over the barricades, allowing the Russian media to report that the civilians were rising up against the evil Ukrainian military. Putin denied that the Russian-equipped, Russian-speaking soldiers were actually Russian troops, instead claiming that they were a part of the civil defense squads of Crimea, and they were made up completely of civilians. But this was an obvious lie. People on the ground watched and recorded as the trucks full of troops poured out of Russian military bases. The Little Green Men worked closely with the bikers and Cossacks. But hundreds of stories coming from the Russian press claiming that these were civilians caused enough confusion to completely paralyze anybody with the ability to stop them. By the time most people in Crimea knew what was happening, it was too late. Later, on the 26th, the first two protesters in Crimea are killed. One had a heart attack, the other was trampled. They were Tatars, a population of Muslims native to the peninsula, and who want Crimea to be independent of both Ukraine and Russia. But the Russian press spun the story to make it seem like they were attacked by right-wing pro-Maidan protesters, justifying retaliatory violence against the Western-leaning pro-Ukraine crowd. On the 28th, Putin's Little Green Men seized control of the Simferopol International Airport and the local TV tower. After that point, no people or information were allowed into Crimea without Putin's approval. The Ukrainian military units, unwilling to fight the civilians and with no orders to fight the Little Green Men, offered no resistance to the Russian troops who, at this point, had taken de facto control over the peninsula. On March 1st, Prime Minister Askanov announced a referendum for unification with Russia in 2 weeks' time, set for March 16th. The referendum passed by 95%. The US and EU called it an illegal invasion and a violation of international law. Russia was kicked out of the G8 and sanctions were introduced, but ultimately the international community was impotent to prevent Russia from occupying the peninsula. On March 18th, Putin signed a bill to annex Crimea. A few weeks later, the outnumbered and vastly outgunned Ukrainian military were forced out. That's it. Just like clockwork, all the pieces fell into place. 3.5 weeks after Russia lost its puppet government in Kyiv, Putin began the occupation of Ukraine. But it wasn't enough for Putin just to take Crimea. If he wanted to keep the peninsula, he had to convince the world that the people of Crimea were happy with the change. From that point on, it became illegal for Crimeans to oppose the government. The protests that did occur quickly quickly turned fatal as Cossacks openly beat people on the streets, but new laws passed in Crimea made reporting on the violence illegal. Prominent pro-Ukrainians that stayed off the streets began to disappear. Forced deportation of the Tatars began almost immediately. Of course, reporting on this story would also get you a lengthy jail sentence. With all the censorship, you might expect information coming out of the peninsula to be sparse, but Putin had a plan for that too. And that plan was party, party, party. For months, Russian media ran stories every day about the latest, craziest parties and about how much fun everyone in Crimea was having now that they were a part of Russia. This was a disaster for Ukraine, not just because of the loss of land, but Crimea emboldened pro-Russian separatists in other parts of the country to rise up at a time when there was effectively no national government to lead the way. Mariupol, Odessa, Donetsk, Luhansk all saw violence inspired by Crimea. And I intend to go through what happened in all those places in future videos.
Insurgent figurehead Igor Girkin has confessed that Crimea's Kremlin-backed referendum on separating from Ukraine in March 2014 was a farce. The former Russian agent described how soldiers without insignia, locally known as Little Green Men, forced regional lawmakers to vote in favor of seceding from Ukraine. In an interview featured on the Politring TV show on Russia's Euromir TV, Girkin said,
"Our troops had to force the deputies into the council hall so that these representatives would vote in favor of our initiatives. I know this because at the time I was commanding a militant team and I've seen it all from the inside. We had absolutely no support from the people, not to mention the Ukrainian army.
Thanks for spending time with me, and I hope I'll see you again. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and help this people meet more videos. Yeah, that's what I said. And don't forget, Crimea belongs to Ukraine.